Okay, let's get started. This is the HTTP working group. If you're not looking for the HTTP working group, you're in the wrong room. You're just on time, gentlemen. I've been doing this for a really long time, and something seems to have changed. Not sure what. For those who don't know, since our last working group meeting, we have a co-chair now. Patrick is joining me as a co-chair, so welcome, Patrick. Please treat him gently, but he's getting up to speed very quickly, so I doubt you'll need to do that much, and soon you will fear him. Yeah. So with that in mind, we have a pretty full agenda. We're meeting today and on Thursday, but Thursday is a short meeting. So let's try and get it through as much as we can. Take it away.
All right. This is the note well. It is Tuesday. You have seen the note well, but noted well. Okay. What we essentially have to cover before we get going is the JabberScribe. Thank you, Karsten. The minutes. Thank you, Pete. And the blue sheets. They are going around the room. So we've gotten through all of this good stuff. The agenda. We've got broken into Tuesday and Thursday. And there are themes. Today's sessions will be about work we've already adopted and the progress on those documents. And Thursday is about essentially potential future work that's been coming up. We'll see how well we do at holding to those themes, but that's the way these things are split up. Before we get going, would anyone like to bash the agenda?
So, Mike Bishop, the secondary certificate auth draft is dependent on some discussion in the TLS meeting, which hasn't happened yet. So I would prefer to move that to Thursday.
Okay. I do not know if we'll have room for that on Thursday or not, to be honest, but we'll certainly defer it today and take updates to the list if that's what we have to do.
I think the thinking there was a very quick update anyway, so yeah.
Okay. A couple announcements, and you should know that over here, Mark whispers in my ear when you stood up to bash the agenda. I don't think that's ever happened before. So, breaking new ground already. We have a barb off tonight at 6:45 in Studio 7, which is on the 6th floor, regarding DNS over HTTP. I will pitch that very briefly as we're looking to see if we can get the right people in the room who are interested in a unified solution to a bunch of different ways DNS over HTTP gets used. You often see HTTP used just as a tunneling substrate. You see HTTP used as a lookup API, as a publishing API. And of course, we've always talked in this room, in this working group, about the semantics of HTTP2 being able to push DNS records and what that means. And we're seeing if there's a spirit among the different communities to be able to pursue a unified solution or not. So if you're willing to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem, that is tonight at 6:45. We should also talk really briefly about Quick. Mark, as you may know, hopefully you do know, is the chair of that new working group. A chair of that new working group. Their charter says that their goal is to minimize connection establishment and overhead transport latency for applications, starting with HTTP2, which makes my ears stand up. And then it says the Quick working group will closely work with the Httpbis, especially on the Quick mapping for HTTP2. So perhaps Mark would like to talk a little bit about how he foresees that happening.
Right. So very briefly, the Quick working group is doing a lot of different things. And some of it may not be of interest to people in this room, but a lot of it will be, I think, because it's effectively doing what you might call the next version of HTTP as a mapping to a new transport protocol. Which is Quick. And there are a large number of decisions to be made in that process that have direct or indirect impact upon HTTP. We literally just had our first meeting just before lunchtime. So that is just getting started. So it's a great time to start getting involved in that. We have a very aggressive charter. We have a number of interim meetings that we're probably going to be holding, the first being in January in Tokyo. So if these are issues that interest you, please do sign up to that mailing list to get involved in that work. Now is the right time to do that.
And in terms of this working group, periodic Checkpoints and reviews.
Right. One of the things that the Quick Working Group is explicitly chartered to do is coordinate with this working group. So I will be wearing a couple of different hats to try and facilitate that, to make sure that this community is comfortable with what's happening over there. Part of that will happen because some of the people who participate here in this room and outside of this room will be following that work and contributing to that work very closely, but we want to make sure that the rest of the community here is up to speed with what's happening there and is bought into what's happening there, and that there aren't any big surprises down the road. So that's a process we'll try and facilitate over the lifetime of the Quick Working Group.
Okay. With that being said, I guess we should move to our active drafts. And the first one is Cache Digest. Let me see if I can find the issues list. There it is. So would you like to speak for Cache Digest, or would Kazuho, are you here? I do not know if you're here.
Oh, there he is. Yeah.
Would you like to come and speak to?
Either way, he seems to want me to. So please feel free to get up to the mic as well. So we have, how long has it been since we published a draft of Cache Digest? It's been a little while now. We incorporated some feedback. The last was November 14, I think. Or no, that's the editor's draft. So that can't be right, because today is near that. November the 1st was the last one. And we incorporated some feedback. We have a number of things, issues still open, as you can see on the issues list. But in recent discussion, I think we've resolved that the target for this specification should probably be experimental, just because we're having a bit of difficulty getting traction with browser implementers right now. Their focus is elsewhere for a variety of reasons, and we're not quite sure that it's going to be implemented in browsers anytime soon. So that gives us a choice. We can either wait for that interest to emerge, or we can publish it as experimental and see if it gets traction in the community that might convince them to implement it. And discussing amongst ourselves as editors, as well as with a few of other stakeholders, we've kind of come to the conclusion that maybe experimental is the right thing to do. So that's something we'd like to bring to the working group as something we'd like to see, especially since it can be implemented in Service Worker. And I think I just saw someone posted a public repo of that. We would want to document, probably in an appendix, perhaps, how to do that, or advice of how to do that, to help that process along. We might end up changing some of the other mechanisms in the draft as well to better suit that, but that's the general plan going forward that we've kind of put together, and we wanted to bring to the working group. I think there's still open questions about, for example, the flags that are in the draft and whether they're appropriate still, and we probably need to talk through those, and to also talk through the different use cases where it might be used if it is ever going to be implemented in browsers. But that's kind of where we're at. So speaking again with an editor hat on, I guess I'd like to hear feedback on that, and then we have specific issues here that we've been talking about that maybe we can dive into briefly. So does that make sense to everyone? Does it not make sense to someone? Sorry, not make sense. Okay. So I think we'll continue on that path, it sounds like. In the open issues, we have advice for service worker implementation, which we just discussed briefly. The flags is a discussion which I think is complex enough that probably it'd be more beneficial to talk about it on the list, and maybe Kazoo and I can talk to each other while we're here about that. That makes sense? And anybody else who's interested?
That's fine.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Server opt-in is an issue that if it's going to be implemented in a browser is going to be critical. But if it's as a service worker kind of implementation, then it's obviously not going to apply, because the installation of the service worker is effectively the opt-in. Just informationally, Mike West has a draft, and I have a draft that we've been talking about how to get kind of server-side hints to a browser that would presumably something like that would serve as the mechanism for a server opt-in, if that ever eventuates.
So Mark,
yes,
Martin Thompson, if this is a frame, it sort of suggests that settings are the right way to deal with that.
Perhaps, yes. Yeah.
Hop by hop, after all.
Although that would require a persistent setting, really, wouldn't it?
Maybe.
Yay.
Yeah, if you care to use this in zero RTT, which is probably a case where
it's going to get more and more interesting.
Yeah. So yes, and yes.
That's why the server hint kind of style is a little more.
This is what makes me even more confident about the experimental thing in terms of breaking new ground. Let's break a whole lot more of it while we're at it and throw some really
Throw all the risk in
crazy
one bucket.
ideas.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe it turns out to be useful. But I think probably the big concern there is that people are going to implement the header field option to get their experimental experience and not really learn anything about what it takes to deploy zero RTT based settings / whatever the rest of the document says. So that to me is another big risk red flag.
Right. The digest algorithm issue, number 228, we've discussed on the issue a fair amount, and my perception is that we've come to a place where, the most straightforward thing to do is to continue to use, I think, what we're using, SHA-256 or SHA-1. It was suggested that we use a non-cryptographic hash, which has some really nice efficiency gains, but we have a reference problem with that, in that none of the ones that we've found so far have a good document we can reference. They're all defined by code. And unless Martin's standing up to say he'll document one of those.
No. Read the large comment there on the screen at your leisure, perhaps. And in it, I explain why I'm uncomfortable with the notion of a hash that doesn't have pre-image resistance.
Sure. Yeah, that is another aspect as well. And I guess one of the pieces of feedback that would be nice is if this is ever going to be implemented in a browser, is it realistic to require that the browser find the list of currently in cache fresh objects for a particular origin, hash all their URLs in real time, and compose a digest out of that and emit it on the wire right after sending the first request, because that's effectively what we require. You can't really store it because freshness means it has to be fresh then. And how realistic is that to implement is what would be great to have feedback on from some implementer.
It's a big ask.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. Okay. Experimental. And then probably the last one worth discussing now is the cache digest and scoping issue, which is, right now the draft defines it as a cache digest is good for an entire origin. And certainly, if the browser is automatically generating and emitting these things, that's kind of at least a reasonable starting point. But of course, if it's being done by service worker, that's a very different thing. And so at the very least, I think we need to perhaps segment the draft in such a way where the scope of the digest isn't described by its payload, so that we can have dynamic scopes effectively. Beyond that, I'm not sure.
I will say it feels like lately there's been a lot of momentum around push and push strategies, and I was a little surprised that, when you said you were willing to move your document to experimental and service workers, no one stood up and, protested. Does this feel, everyone agree that this is the viable path forward here?
No, Mike Bishop, Microsoft. I think that push is probably not very viable without this. And so I'm interested to see what it does, but frankly, I just don't have dev time to invest in an implementation right now, and so I can't contribute to moving it forward. I don't think experimental is a bad idea. We can always come back and standardize it if it works out.
I'll note I saw nodding heads when Mike said that push isn't terribly viable without this.
Subodh Iyengar. I think push is sort of viable without this if you absolutely know that you've never sent the story before and you kind of rank the stories like we do. So I don't think cache digest is an exact requirement for push, but what would be nice for push is have a unified story across how push effectively use push across different browsers because different browsers deal with push differently. So that is the actual blocker for push rather than cache digest being adopted.
I've never done this. No, I've never done this. Mark Nottingham, Akamai. It would make us. I think there's a combination of the two. I agree that we need to define push more solidly, and there is a lot of divergence, which is really suboptimal. But at the same time, we would really like to see this. It would give us a lot more information and not require us to have to duplicate a lot of logic in something like Service Worker. I just had to do it once.
Yeah, no, that was good. That's good. So, well, I guess with that, move on to our next draft, which is client hints. And Ilya is not with us, but see if I can find this because I like this one in the issues list. Yeah, there we are. No results matched your search for open issues. The working group last call was completed without any objection. So does that mean we're ready for IETF last call?
That means we're ready for IETF last call. I see that the document shepherd has been lazy and not done the write-up, so I'll go ahead and do that because it's me, and we'll get it through the process.
Excellent.
There was a last-minute kind of request to add a few more things to it, but I think we're well and truly past the time to do that right now.
Yeah, just confirming. This is again experimental. Right.
It is indeed experimental.
Yes.
That was an
just so
agreement we
everyone
had
knows.
last time.
The bar's set just that much lower.
So Martin, why don't you come on up and we can talk about encrypted content encoding?
Yeah, I have one issue. I just added to the list. If you refresh the page, you will see that Ekadata review. I think the sort of non-substantial comments that are in that review, as well as a couple of the other ones, were either misunderstandings or can be relatively easily addressed. This is the one that I think needs some discussion, at least in this group. I'm inclined to do this. We have a header field that carries keys as a key distribution mechanism. It's kind of shitty, and it adds a bunch of bulk to the draft and creates some confusion based on its use in examples. And it would be relatively easy to remove. And the consequences for the people who are actually using it are essentially zero, aside from, I think Julian's got some work that would potentially rely on it. But it's relatively straightforward to build a mechanism to replace it that's arguably superior. So the thing in question I'm talking about is the out-of-band content encoding, and the idea is that the body of the out-of-band content encoding would include the keys necessary to decrypt the payload. That would be the simplest design, and it neatly works around the problem and is arguably superior. Julian.
Julian Reschke. So my minor concern here is that if there are other specs that want to build on encryption encoding, all of these other specs will have to come up with their own individual ways to marshal the key, which might be okay, but maybe it's not the right thing to do. And the other thing is the encryption encoding spec currently talks about key IDs. So you can identify a key by a name. That name was used in the crypto key header field. And if that header field goes, all the language and machinery about the key IDs somehow hang in the air and have nothing to be used in. So it's probably still a useful concept, but then it would probably need some more prose to explain what it is and how it's to be used.
And given that I received this review comment only very recently, I have not had time to write that prose, but I we'll take the effort to do that within the next sort of week or so, and get a new version of the draft in front of the working group, and we can talk about where we go from there. My hope is working group last call in this sort of time frame.
Third one.
Right. We really mean it last call.
We really mean it one. I've had discussions with folks who are downstream of this in terms of web push. They are okay with us changing things on them. It's kind of crappy when you've deployed code, but such is life. We implemented drafts and we understand the risks. Well, at least most of us understood the risks of that. I think there's a bunch of people out there who will not have understood the implications and be sad, but that leaves us in browser land implementing 2 versions of the spec to make those people happy. And we've talked about strategies to deal with that. There's nothing, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing fundamentally wrong from a security perspective with what we used to have. So we'll continue to deploy that until such a time as we think it's safe to remove. That's all.
Is there also a larger conversation to be had here? Not specifically about this, but we had talked about encodings and whether they should be self-descriptive or not, and whether or not that should be a general paradigm going forward. And this might get some of the folks who are staring at their laptops a little more engaged, because it's more of a general sort of evolutionary approach for...
I completely forgot about that, because I sort of got the impression from the discussion that people had taken that as read, on the list discussion anyway. But I think that's a good point. Now, if you have the minutes for it, I think it would be good to hear from anyone who disagrees with the notion that content encoding should be self-describing, at least to the extent that the constraints of the encoding allow it to be. Obviously, the out-of-band encoding is not self-contained, and something like sandwich is inherently not self-contained. Sort of leads to the discussion. I think you have Vlad's draft on the list of drafts to talk about today. Thursday. That would be a good discussion to be having in that context as well. So maybe we can defer that till Thursday, and I can put some slides together on it.
Sure.
Or,
we probably have more time today than Thursday.
There are no slides really to have on it, other than this is the principle that we think is good. If anyone has any dissenting opinions on that, then maybe we can sort of have that discussion. But do you think we need a document that says that? Would be the only question that I have.
We could open a ticket for the next revision of the core specs to actually mention that. I guess we don't need a separate document for that, but...
I think I made that suggestion on list, yeah.
Mike Bishop, Microsoft. I will note that I do not disagree with the principle, but I have a content encoding that doesn't follow it, and I can't rev it at this point. So
we're going to find out if that IETF army really exists, right? Thank you, Martin. But don't sit down yet, because the next one on the list is opportunistic security.
So this one, I believe, yeah, we're still waiting for.
Yeah, I think this is probably just me not actually going through and closing issues as a result of the discussion that we had. I think the point of the discussion here would be to close the deal on the stuff that we've discussed on the list. I think people have been generally happy with the direction that was taken. The one concern that was raised, well, there are 2 concerns raised with the proposal that I made. One of those I addressed. We discussed whether we do this for HTTP 1.1. We don't. That seemed to be fairly universally accepted once we sort of worked it through. And the other one was Eric Nygren was particularly concerned about cases where you coalesce secure content, HTTPS content, with opportunistically secured content, and we sort of stalled on that one a little bit. And I should have put together some material to present on that, probably, because that is something that I think we should flush out. But I haven't seen Eric around this week, but
No, Eric's not here.
I've seen him on Meet.echo. Is he?
Is he on? Yes, he is. Eric?
Eric? It's only midnight in Boston.
Oh, yeah.
Keenly aware of that, aren't you? Can you channel him? Thanks.
So the question here that I have
If we come on
fundamentally
meetup, we
is
could
whether
thread
we
problem.
need something and whether something like the origin frame would be sufficient, or whatever permutation we discuss later on would be sufficient for that. And I think we're going to have some discussions about the scope of origin frame, and
That's up soon. Yeah.
if in theory origin frame were sufficient for this, would it be sufficient for this is the question.
He's typing.
So Mike Bishop, I guess my question there would be, is the concern about the security of having them both in the same encryption context, or about the server getting confused? Because if it's the server confusion, then I feel like the .well-known resource is already a server opt-in to, yes, I can handle this. If there's an actual security threat, then I think the draft should say don't mix it, but I'm not aware of a security threat.
He just. Yeah.
So Eric says it really depends on what the default is. For instance, allowing the origin to opt into mixed resource with origin frame is fine. Security is the concern.
I'm not sure how to interpret that. We already have as a default mixing content from multiple origins. The question is whether we allow mixing of content from those multiple secure origins with now insecure origins. And Eric has a number of concerns about that, and he outlined them fairly well on the list, I think. As with all of these risks of confusion, the question is how much effort we go to try to sort of explicitly alleviate the concern, as opposed to rely on, you know, the fact that the server's doing the right thing when it actually advertises this opportunistic resource. And that's really,
Right.
there's a lot of squish in that area.
Well, you know, we could, you know, if we chop it up and say, it doesn't sound terribly controversial to say there should be some control that allows the server to either opt in or opt out of mixing schemes effectively.
Yeah.
The question is what the default is.
Right, and I think it gets difficult, and we might end up having the origin frame discussion. But if you imagine the origin frame sort of distilling down to, I only want to receive requests from the SNI and by extension implicitly the HTTPS origin and the SNI that was in the original TLS handshake, then that signal might be sufficient. Unfortunately, we don't really have a more explicit signal than the opportunistic stuff for general coalescing currently, because we sort of let that cat out of the bag by default already.
So Eric says, I only see the origin frame being a good option to address the security concerns before the client tries to mix. Otherwise, it is opening up a risk exposure until the server says okay to mix.
So the question is it the mixing is an interesting question, because it sent you the HTTP opportunistic resource, which says that it's happy with the insecure resources on this origin. I don't know how to deal with that problem. I think we're into.
You mean on this connection?
How much certainty do you want? I can invent any number of architectures that would be probably bad, but they would still fail the test of this. You can have a server that provides you with looks to provide you with a valid opportunistic resource, but is completely incapable of doing so.
When is an opt-in not an opt-in?
Right. We're often sort of very sort of nebulous territory, and I tend to think that we should err on the simplest possible solution side when it comes to these sorts of areas of uncertainty, because we're just making things more complex. Not a lot of real provable benefit.
Okay, I should also point out that later in this session, Nick is going to make a presentation based on Cloudflare's experience with an earlier version of this. So we'll get a little data and feedback that might also be useful as part of the last call. Okay.
He's still typing.
Is Nick? Oh, Eric.
Eric, yeah.
I thought you meant Nick was still typing on the slides back there.
That's a common experience. Yeah.
Should we display the Jabber channel so people can real time?
Karsten? Sorry.
Keep the microphone. Eric says, I think origin frame dot well known and a setting are all fine ways to allow servers to indicate that it is okay to mix schemes.
So if I'm reading that correctly, it sounds like as long as there's mechanisms, what, Eric? Oh, that's Martin, not Eric. Yeah, the question I think you're trying to ask is, do you want the combination or just some of them? Yeah. We can probably take this to the list, I think.
Yeah.
We just need to get to a conclusion on it because it's blocking the draft.
Right.
Any of these are sufficient as long as it is opt-in from the server.
It being mixing, I would assume. Okay.
Okay. Thank you for that. I think that's helpful. That'll help us get this going. Mark, how do you want to handle the common header in JFE? You want to? Julian sent a couple documents.
Yeah. That's what we're up to, isn't it?
Yeah, I want to do that one first. Julian, you want to start with this?
Oh, yes. Okay. That's the simple one. Next slide. So this is something that HTTP has inherited from email, a way to escape parameters in header fields to support non-ASCII characters. And the mechanism in email was pretty complicated. And a few years ago, we defined a subset from that actually was implemented by a few browsers and made a standalone document. And since that document came out, all the other browsers actually have implemented that as well. So that was a success. Next slide. The one thing that not everybody wanted to do was support ISO 8859. So, and I think everybody agrees that a single encoding is sufficient, which is UTF-8. So one change in this spec is that it only says that UTF-8 encoding is required, and by definition means that senders should only use UTF-8. Grammar references and language and terminology has been updated to be based on the latest HTTP specs. Next slide. So everything I plan to do for this draft has been done. This is a draft that uses non-ASCII characters, so we will challenge the IESG and the RFC editor to do something useful with it. We had a few weeks ago a discussion in the working group whether we actually want to discourage use of this escaping mechanism in new specs, because there might be better ways to do that. But my take is that we don't have yet a clear understanding what the better thing is. So we put that aside. Working group last call finished a few days ago with a single editorial comment, which I have fixed in the editor's copy, but not submitted anything new. So that's where we are.
So I need to do the write-up on that one as well, and we can submit it, I think. No, we didn't get any working group last call issues except for the one that Julian mentioned, which is a very mechanical typo issue.
All right. Thank you, Julian. Does anyone else want to make Last call comments, or?
No, never ask for them.
Oh. I don't know even what to do with that. So with JFV, and do we have Paul Henning on the line too?
He's on Meet Echo.
Should we just start with JFV? And we have invited presentations on both JFV and draft camp. I forget what the rest of the name of that is, but it's an individual draft related.
The common header structure, or header common structure, sorry.
Let me ask these questions. Who in the room has read the JFV draft, and who in the room has read the common header structure draft? So first JFV, and second draft common header. Okay, it's about 20% for both. And so is anyone rooting for one or the other? Just joking. Just joking. Julian, would you like to do the presentation and go from there?
So everybody knows that I don't like JSON. So just as a background, I'm an XML person, but I don't even recall exactly how I got to the point 2 years ago that I wanted to try how JSON would look in a header field, but for some reason I started with that. That had been around for 2 years essentially, and people started actually using that. And at the same time, the working group discussed that we should do something on the standards track to achieve more consistency in how header fields are parsed, and decided to adopt this document as something we work on, not necessarily meaning that we wanted to use that specific format. Next slide. So some of the open discussion points about this draft. Using JSON makes header fields a bit chatty. There's the open question about whether list-shaped header fields in HTTP are something good or something evil. If we decide it's something good, then the current draft is aligned with that, in that it essentially makes JSON-shaped header fields lists, so it's compatible with the HTTP list header field format. And one benefit of that is, as header fields can occur multiple times in HTTP messages, people who define new header fields need to deal with that case anyway. So the simplest case is to forbid it, but still then they better define the error handling. So this format actually embraces the format and is compatible with repeating header field values. Then there are concerns about JSON in itself, like the data types it has. It doesn't have a timestamp. It has limits on what you can do with numbers. Then there's the potential interop problems with non-unique member names. Some of these problems I think I have addressed by essentially requiring senders to use iJSON. And Ilya pointed out that the latest ECMA standard has specified what JSON parsers need to do with non-unique member names. So the current approach in the spec is to forbid senders to use it, but also to allow recipients to use a standard ECMA JSON parser to process them, which means that it will use the first instance and drop the remaining instances. So I think the biggest interop problems are actually resolved by that. And I asked Ilya whether that language would be sufficient for their users in W3C specs, and he said yes. So a bigger question here is this something that we brainstorm for and define for HTTP 1.1 and HTTP 2, or should we have a broader discussion about header field formats in future versions of HTTP, which might be HTTP over QUIC or not, who knows? So once we move away from just a sequence of octets that may or may not be transported as 8-bit to something else, we can, of course, do more fancy things. Next slide. Oh, yes. So in the meantime, we have 3 specs in the W3C space that actually use this format. And if we decide not to go the JSON route, the question is, what do we do with this draft? I mean, one of the chairs told me they should figure out themselves. My position would be we should just publish it as it is and continue our quest for better header formats in a separate document. Next slide. Yeah.
So I'd like to respond to that, but with my me hat on. But I'm too lazy to get up to the mic. I've done it once and I've had my fun. You said that you thought that the interoperability issues were solved by specifying the ECMA. I don't believe that's true. It may be solved on the response header side. Sorry. It may be solved when browsers consume response headers, but when servers consume request headers, it won't be, because they'll probably use whatever JSON implementation is handy. It's an attractive nuisance. You leave things like that lying around, people will eventually use them. So I'm not sure I believe that it's quite that easy, unfortunately. Regarding the question of whether we publish it or not, you know, two of those specs are, you know, relatively early stage specs in the W3C, I believe. The other one is basically just a personal doodling. It's not a accepted spec. So I'm not convinced that, you know, that requires us to publish the spec, except maybe something, you know, independent stream if you wanted to. That's me personally, very much not as chair. But I think we need to talk a lot more about what we want to do as a working group before we get to that.
And just to be clear, when I asked what to do with the spec, if we decide that as a working group we don't want to recommend that format, I'm totally okay with that. It still leaves the question whether we should have a document published in the IETF or on by the RFC editor, which defines this format, which would include an independent submission.
Sure. Yeah, and this is a little bit of a weird one, because what we're doing is effectively trying to give advice and build, you know, a funnel towards one format, and having more than one document doing that is perhaps counterproductive. That's why I'm concerned about publishing it, if we're not sure it's the right answer.
Should we stick a pin in that for just a minute and see if Paul Henning would like to present his work?
Paul Henning, I'm told that if you're using the mobile UI, you may not see the chat. So add yourself to the queue, and we'll let you speak if you're there.
Please be there, because Mark,
well, he's there.
That's a lifelong dream of pressing this red button.
I want to press the red button. Yeah, it's awesome. Here, I'm going to lift the cover in anticipation. That's awesome.
Can you be trusted with the codes?
Don't go there too soon, man. Has he said something?
No, but Paul should first click on the chat icon, and then he will find the controls to unmute himself. Paul, did you hear that?
He may be asleep. I wouldn't blame him. I think it's some ungodly hour there. The chat icon is the balloon icon in the lower right of his UI. And Meet Echo person, please don't unmute him, because I really want to press the red button.
Okay, while we wait for that,
yeah.
Is it imminent? No. All right, while we wait for that or to happen or not to happen, I guess to the question of what should we tell those other authors, Martin kind of already addressed this earlier when he revved a draft that someone else had implemented. My opinion is those are the risks of implementing a draft. And if we don't think this is the right thing, we shouldn't publish it just for the sake of publishing something.
So your chairs are in alignment on this issue.
There you go.
So Martin Thompson, I generally agree with that. If we're going to publish something as proposed standard, I think it should be because we think it's good for the internet. And it is my personal opinion that the JFV stuff is not good for the internet necessarily. I mean, not holistically. I mean, there's some good stuff in there that's totally worth doing, and it's sort of a pretty good exploration of some of the space. And we've certainly learned a lot in the process from having had it. So I'm grateful that it exists. But
Paul Henning is here.
Yeah.
Can you cue yourself? We can't hear you yet. Can you cue yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Cool. I don't really have much to say about the common structure document. It was sort of a hack going home from the working group in Stockholm, or from the meeting up there. There were some comments at the meeting up in Stockholm that says that we have 19 different formats of headers already, and that's too many. And I thought, well, maybe we can build a structure from that. So I sat down with the RFC 723X documents and tried to pull out a structure from the headers we have already defined in those, and found that surprisingly we actually could do that. It might be a good idea going forward to say that we should probably have new headers stick inside this common structure format to not make that problem any worse.
Sorry, Paul Henning? Can you try
yes.
getting closer to the microphone, please?
Yes, is that better?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay. It might be a good idea, simply as a point of avoiding extra work, to require new headers to stick inside the common structure format, to not make our own, to not dig the hole any deeper. Whether this is a challenger to JSON or some other structured format is a good question. There could be some advantages in that using common structure would allow us to do semantic compression if we ever do something to follow HPAC or HTTP3, which JSON may not afford us in the same way. But I think the biggest gain from this draft, if we adopt it, is that we could stop the proliferation of bespoke header parsers needed. We saw it, this is not intended as a criticism, but we saw it with the encryption draft that introduced a new header, now removed, which did not fit into common structure and which would have required a separate piece of code to parse it. I think that's more or less what I have to say.
Paul Henning, it's Mark, and we've talked about this before. For me, one of the things that might be interesting to talk about is the need for recursive structure. In that, if we're able to keep it to lists and objects of simple data types, then it simplifies the format quite a bit. And we've gone back and forth on that a little bit. Do you want to speak at all to that?
I don't think I have a position on it. I put the recursive structure in there in this first draft to show that it would be possible to do so. That's not the same as it's a wise idea to do it. And in general, this is not a sufficient specification for any one header. This is a serialization of it, so to speak. So any one header being defined could simply say no recursion allowed, or define itself so that no recursion is possible, and we'll just have this possibility sitting there in case anybody ever needs it.
But we've talked about some effectively a schema language, and so presumably it would need to be capable of that too.
Yeah, if we go that far, we would need to have the schema language being able to express whatever we need the schema language to be able to express. But I don't know if well, I don't know if we're going there, and I don't know if it's worth the effort to go there. That would have to be a judgment call on the working group. I'm simply throwing this out there to point out that we do have 19 of the RFC 723X headers that can live inside this definition of a header format, and thus potentially save some code and some bugs and some future anguish if we tell people to stick to this one going forward. As I said, this can perfectly well live in parallel with the JSON headers. They will just not be common structure, and just like other RFC 723X headers are not common structure. So it's just a way to corral future headers in that sense.
Julie?
Just one point, or several points here. As a matter of fact, the working group has been, for every draft that was coming through the working group, encouraging the authors very strongly to reuse some of the more common ABNFs from the existing HTTP specs and not to invent something new. So one example would be, for instance, the prefer header that was defined while we were doing the HTTP revision. So we've been doing that for a long time with mixed results. So if header fields are defined without us knowing about them, they end up being strange sometimes. But as long as we've been watching, we've been trying to enforce that all the way already. And I think regarding the specific formats, there are some questions that we should come to a opinion about that would affect both the JSON spec and your spec and other specs essentially. So one question is, do we like list-shaped header fields or don't we? And the other one is, knowing that we probably can safely transmit non-ASCII characters even in HTTP 1.1, do we want to use that in practice, or are we scared about existing server and client APIs that assume that it's ISO 8859? Because one of the driving reasons why I came up with the JSON format was because it would solve the internationalization problem automatically for me. And if we all agree that we can safely transfer non-ASCII characters in 1.1 header fields, then this problem goes away and doesn't need a specific solution. We could just allow them in quoted string values and be done with that, as you do in your spec. So I think these are two questions about HTTP in general that it would be good if we had an opinion on that we agree on, and that would influence whatever we say in these drafts about header field structure.
I think I included the UTF-8 string in the common structure draft against my better judgment. I don't think personally that UTF or any other characters with the top bit set belongs in the HTTP1 protocol. But I'm firmly of the opinion that we should deliver tools and not policies. So I included the UTF string, and people can try and use it. And if they find it works, that's fine. And if they find it doesn't work, well, too bad. I don't think we should use either JSON or common structure to mandate UTF-8 cleanliness in HTTP headers, because that's not going to happen. But there may be isolated larger or smaller environments where you can actually do it, and I think we should give people the sensible tools to do it in that case. But I wouldn't want to standardize anything that says you have to do UTF-8 in HTTP1 headers. That will have to be strictly optional in my book. What does content encoding, businessman in suit levitating even mean?
So I guess, what are our next steps here?
I was going to ask, do we feel the future of this document is? It's sounding like this is something we're interested in considering for adoption, and maybe letting JFV lapse. Was that how that conversation just happened?
Well, we adopted JFV with, if you remember, with the idea that it was more of a placeholder to express the working group's interest, rather than something we were saying, yes, this is the right proposal. We were willing to accept that it might change. I guess maybe a little more discussion, a little more data might help before we take a next step. Personally, I think after listening to this, I want to go out and play with some APIs and some client tools and figure out, where the edges are and the sharp, pointy bits. And then having a bit more data might help make that decision.
There were a lot of hands that went up who had read both of these drafts, and this is a good place to have an opinion based on your implementation experience just generally in the wild, if not of these drafts. So I'm curious if there are other thoughts to be had. Martin?
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, I think that the sort of target of PHK's draft was a little bit unclear when we first went into this one, and there's a few aspects of the draft that sort of served to increase that confusion. The angle bracket thing was a good example of that. If indeed it is, as we just sort of heard, just a way of writing down what it is to make a good HTTP header field and sort of try to unify the format so that there's a single parser and that sort of thing, that's super. But I think in all of the discussions we've been having, people have been looking for something else as well. And I don't know what that something else is, but I've heard a number of different desires from people along the lines of, I would like to have a format that is more byte efficient, or I would like to have a format that is more capable of being processed efficiently. And so there are a number of these other desires that's doesn't seem to be addressing now, which suggests that we still have some space to explore in this area. So I don't want to foreclose on anything.
Mike Bishop, Microsoft. I will say that the something else of having something that is more efficient to parse and compress and validate is something that becomes easier if we have a common structure. Whether that's PHK's draft, whether that is Heaven Help Us JSON. Once we know that there is a common format that most headers are going to fall into, then we can define in the next version of HPAC an efficient way to compress that, or we can have good, well-tested parsing code across implementations. But to get there, first we have to have a lot of headers that look and work more or less the same way, and we don't quite have that right now.
But the question of a next generation of HPAC is a timely question.
It is.
Indeed.
That's what I'm working on my laptop.
So I guess I'm still not clear, Mark, on what we think the future of this work is.
I can add a little bit about the what my intent was. First, my intent was simply to document that there exists a common structure for 19 headers out of the standardized one. I've not looked at non-RFC 723X RFCs. And it's true that the recursion thing sticks in the throat for some people. And as I said, it's purely optional. We can just remove it. The other little detail is that the recursion is built on the ability for a HTTP header to self-declare as common structure, so that if you have a private header in an installation, you would stick that in angle brackets to say this is common structure, and that way you could trigger the appropriate parsing and whatever in the far end without having to hard code a positive list of headers and so on. That's purely optional too. If we don't want that, we don't have to take it. Julian's comments about the working group having tried to steer people to pre-existing header syntaxes is fine. I don't know how much evidence there is that it actually works, given Julian's encryption draft. But this could serve as the document we point people at for that purpose, if that's what we want. I agree with Roy about the future compression point. One of the things we left on the table with HPAC was we didn't compress dates in any intelligent way. For us to be able to do that, we have to be able to recognize them as dates. So some kind of semantic format will be needed if we want better compression in the next HPAC.
So personally, I think, this is Mark again, I think this is an interesting path to continue walking down. I think that some sketch of what the schema component might look like would be interesting, because the real target for this is spec authors, and we need to give them something to hang on to and to play with. So that would probably be the next step in my mind. Besides a lot more investigation and discussion, I think that one of the things we'll need to address if we get serious about this is that a big part of the purpose of a thing like this is to normalize error handling and to make sure that everything acts consistently when there's a syntactic error or there's a strange input. That removes the need to specify a lot of error handling for people parsing. So we want to make sure we get that right.
I see that more as stuff that builds on top of this, and I don't necessarily see it belonging in the same document. I think even if we just publish this with some sensible editing, apologies for my Danglish, I think this would serve to lay down a line that says future HTTP headers should look like this to not make the problems any worse. And if there is a basis to work on from that with the scheme language or higher level structure or common error handling, then we can do that. But if you apply this to the 19 existing headers, they all have individual descriptions of their error handling. You wouldn't be able to generalize that inside common structure in the first place anyway.
With respect to unifying error handling, I agree that of these existing fields that look as if they are using a common structure, we have small differences in whitespace handling and also in how we expect the error handling to happen. But then maybe that's actually a bug that we want to fix, because I don't think anybody intentionally defined these header fields to have widely varying error handling. So maybe that's something that we actually just need to fix in a future version of the HTTP spec, even though it's not exactly compatible. But I mean, the fact that we have some header fields that allow white space around the assignment in a parameter and some field definitions that do not, that can't be intentional. It's just that people didn't think about it. People didn't understand linear white space and ABNF and so on. So that's nothing we actually want to preserve for future revisions of the HTTP spec, I think. So I wouldn't be too much concerned about it being impossible to make them more consistent, because we really should make them more consistent.
This is Mark again. Just personally, I agree with that. I think before we went down that path, I'd want to have a lot more data about how the current implementations behave in those details.
Yeah, and hopefully my last comment on that, as we know that most implementation of header field parsers are completely broken, maybe this whole activity is an opportunity to replace those broken parsers by a new, shiny, flexible parser that can be configured to process the various header fields properly and have them in the various browsers, and then all this existing broken code will be gone anyway.
Seems like it needs a lot of buy-in from certain parties.
And a minor miracle.
Sorry?
And a minor miracle.
Ah,
So it seems like there's a lot of interest in this work, right?
I would characterize it
Yeah.
that way, yeah.
So should we maybe take a sense of the room if they're interested? If this is a document we would want to adopt, I guess we've already adopted sort of the space, but adopt this as a working group draft?
I think I'd phrase it as maybe who's interested in pursuing the path that Paul Henning, who thinks that the path that Paul Henning has laid out as a potential future is suitable to kind of switch into the place of JFV. We're ready to make that switch of the tracks to the new document, if that makes sense. Am I mixing metaphors again?
Is that manifesting itself as a new document, or are we just going to sort of cut and paste into
That's-
JFV
That's
common
details.
header?
I think it's probably a new document, but yeah.
Okay.
I think that's the editors figure it out.
Okay. So we'll try and get a sense of the room of who thinks that is a reasonable path, that our future is to explore whether or not common header meets our needs and our needs to make recommendations in the space.
And I think we take two hums. One is, yes, that is the case. And the other, the negative is not necessarily this isn't the path, but we don't know yet. We're not ready to make that decision yet.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, you should do this. You're the pro.
No.
I've never done a hum before.
Come on, here you go.
Do they look ready to hum?
Do you look ready to
All
hum?
right, here's question one. Hum if you believe that this is the path that we should be going down. Hum now.
Common header, Paul's common header.
Sorry, it's common header policy, the Paul's presentation. Please hum now. And who, by humming, is either opposed or does not feel they have enough information to agree with that first statement? Please hum now.
There was still a hum there, but the first was noticeably stronger.
Yeah.
Paul, you had an opportunity to hum there and like just completely blow the rest of the room away.
Yeah.
I actually have a button here called hum. It's there.
Okay.
So I'm interested for anyone who hummed for hum number 2, if they might want to take this opportunity to defend their position, because I think most of the mic time has been given to people who were in favor of the first proposition.
Ted Hardy, I was in the might need more information section of hum 2, since there weren't 3 hums. And it was primarily because I thought that Mark's point earlier about finding where the pointy bits of the stick were would be a wise thing to do. And that there's kind of, it can go along as an independent submission while that pointy bits of the stick are identified. But I have no great objection. I mean, I'm not going to get up and find a pail of gasoline in a match or anything like that.
To be clear, I think that the pointy bit investigation, as we'll now call it, is going to affect whatever path we take in this.
So I'm getting up, although I hummed for 1. I think what we need to make sure is that we agree on the scope, because the common structure draft not only defines structure but also data types, and I'm not completely sure that we are ready for that.
So here's another Jabber comment from Roy Fielding. I have difficulty with abstract and unproven syntax being used as a future protocol guideline, but I see no reason not to explore various alternatives as experimental work.
And as we've said elsewhere and at other times, I think, when we adopt something, it doesn't necessarily mean we will finish that, or that it will become a standard, or that it will look substantially like the input document. It's more, one of the challenges we face is making sure that we're focused on, achievable results and on particular documents. And by adopting it, we can lend some focus to one effort.
Joe Hildebrand, do you think that this is far enough along that it does focus the conversation adequately?
I think that it's still, this is me personally, and Patrick might have a different answer, which would be interesting to hear.
And to be clear, the reason why I'm asking you personally is because the statement that you made earlier about wanting to do a little bit of exploration made a lot of sense to me, and so I'm asking you as in your personal views, not as chair.
Sure. I think that the exploration was not, the nature of it was not whether we can do anything or not in this space. We can definitely, I think, and we should personally, I think, definitely do something in this space. We can do a lot better than what we've got right now. It's just the question of what's reasonable to try and foist upon the world based upon the diversity of existing implementations. And that kind of information will help us a lot. Whether we choose Jason or Paul Henning's approach or anything else. I think that adopting something like this, it is still embryonic. It is still something that we're just really beginning to talk about, but it's pretty clear at this point that we've already adopted JFV as a way to focus the conversation, and it appears that we've moved past that. And so we should probably reflect that by de-adopting JFV and adopting this, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, so my first comment would be to really echo that last bit that Mark said. I think this is just an evolution of the space we've already dedicated some working group energy towards, and I think that's a positive evolution, so I would support it. And my second comment is pretty clever of Joe to come to the mic to ask someone else a question about their opinion, so I will turn that around and say, Joe, what's your opinion?
This is Joe Hildebrand. I do believe that reducing the number of parsers in the future is a wildly interesting thing to aim for. Whether that parser is Seaboard, JSON, whatever, I don't have a strong opinion about, other than everybody knows I like Seaboard and I like JSON and whatever. But I don't know if we know enough of what the edges of the design space are to know what's possible. So in H2, for instance, if I can get away with Seaboard without having to base 64 or base 85 encode, whereas in H1, I would, to me, that would be fine because it would give yet another reason for H2 to be faster than H1. So that's my current thought on the topic, which is unhelpful in answering the question you just asked about whether we should adopt this particular document.
So it sounds like we should maybe wrap this one up on the list, but it sounds like, especially because we're already in the JFE space, it looks like we'll be having more of this discussion going forward, right? Okay.
But it seems like the discussion on the list is around adopting this and replacing JFE.
I think that's what I heard.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. So the next thing on the agenda is the origin frame. Mark, are you going to be presenting this?
I will talk about it. I will not be, presenting. By the way, thank you very much, Paul Henning, for getting up so early. We really appreciate it. So the origin frame. I've been talking kind of in the hallways and in other places to a bunch of folks about this draft. And we started out, if folks recall, with a motivation of some folks were getting connections, HTTP2 connections, where coalescing was happening on the connection, and the server did not want that coalescing to happen, perhaps because, if you have a wildcard cert or a SAN cert and you have 15, different potential origins, but the server only wants to test one of those origins with HTTP2, and it turns out that using HTTP2 on those other origins confuses their metrics or breaks something or whatever. That's not a great story. And so it actually hinders the deployment of HTTP2. CDNs, for example, have this problem, of which I'm an employee. So that was the core motivation. So we said, okay, well, what does one do when one wants to, express this to the client? And the approach that we took was to have a frame type that said, these are the origins that this connection are good for. And so you just list them in a frame, and then the client knows, okay, don't use, something that's not on this list on this connection. And that's an optimization. It's important to point out that, it could be that the client doesn't understand that frame type. So the server still has to be able to correctly handle requests for something that isn't appropriate on that connection, which means a 421 status code. I'm not authoritative. This connection is not authoritative for that origin. It's just an optimization so that you don't have that round trip of, oh crap, I've got to spin up a new connection. And so we had that for a little while, and then we realized that there are maybe other use cases for expressing what the origins for a connection are. And so we added this capability, which we kind of thought was a somewhat abstract capability that might be used in other places, where we're talking about a set. It's a set of origins that the connection is good for. Let's have a structured way where we can add to that set and remove from that set and express set operations. And so in a more recent draft, we added that capability, which upped the complexity a little bit, but not horrifically. And now it's a much more capable thing. We've held on to it and kind of put a pin in it for a little while, because one of the other major use cases for that is something I think we'll discuss a little later on, which is the secondary certificates work. It is, how do we add new authoritative servers to this connection, even though it wasn't in the original certificate presented by TLS. So this has been an ongoing discussion both in this working group, now in the TLS working group. I think we'll hear about that either later today or on Thursday. But there's an obvious, kind of need to be able to negotiate, in some fashion what is going to be used on the connection. But the precise requirements are still unclear, and we were holding on to the origin frame as one possible mechanism to use in that negotiation. So in those discussions that I referenced so long ago when I began this lengthy explanation, the hallway discussions, there's been a bit of a change of heart by some people, which is maybe we shouldn't hold on to this thing forever and hoping that in the hope, and it is very much hope-based, that we're going to be able to use it for that other use case. Maybe we should drastically simplify it and ship it so that people who have this very real problem right now of not being able to use HTTP2 because coalescing happens when it's not useful to use coalescing, maybe we should just ship them something that works for their use case and address the other use cases separately and do them in a way that's more tailored to those other use cases. And so this has not been talked about on list yet. It's not been made, there's no concrete proposal yet, but my current thinking is perhaps we should abandon the origin draft, frame draft, or at least park it in perpetuity until those use cases emerge, and come up with something much simpler, which is effectively just a setting. One bit which says, one of the proposed semantics that I've heard floated out there is only use this connection for what was negotiated in the SNI, the SNI host for HTTPS. And that solves that use case of coalescing is happening and I don't want it to happen. Anything beyond that, we have this more complex mechanism in the wings, we can bring it out if necessary. The benefit being that a single bit setting is very cheap and easy to deploy, to get into browsers, and we can meet these use cases where this pain is being found a little bit easier. So that's kind of where my head is at right now as an editor of that spec. I've talked to the other editor, which is my colleague Eric Nygren. He may have some other thoughts about it as well. And this is, I should point out, just a thought at this point. It's not something that I'm convinced is the right solution, but I think it's worth talking about here. So any discussion of that?
Mike Bishop, Microsoft. So as one of the people working on the alternate solution, I will say that what I was originally trying to pull origin in for was to say, hey, I'm also authoritative for these things. If you're interested, you might ask to see my cert.
Right.
And with some evolution to enable the server to just send you the cert, that may not be necessary. So if the origin frame went back to saying, you think I'm authoritative for these things, but I'm only authoritative for the subset, well, if it sends you a cert and then wants to pare the list back down, that's fine. So I don't know that we need to pursue the origin expanding the list of origin frame expanding the list of origins for which the server is authoritative. Whether you want to be able to scope it down to a specific list or just turn off coalescing altogether, that depends on what people are running into. In our case, our server implementation, we determined it was actually cheaper to just start supporting coalescing than to try and have any special handling to stop it.
To be clear, the problems that we've heard that we originally had with this were not so much about implementation issues; it's about deployment issues. So.
Oh, hey, Pat McManus. Feels so much more comfortable. This is nice.
Old times.
I'm one of those folks, I think, who's had a bit of a change of heart. So I still actually believe in the full scope of the vision of Origin, and in particular being able to add origins together and get more multiplexing going on one connection. But there is a pain point we've seen in other deployments. Yours is not the only CDN I've had contact me and saying that, particularly when customers are doing some testing and things, they end up with traffic in places they do not anticipate. And it can sometimes be a difficult row to hoe to describe for the merits of 421 and all those kinds of things going forward. So I think, coalescing is both one of the big benefits of H2 and a pain point. And I think this setting is a nice way to just surgically attack sort of that pain point for that going forward. And I support it on that basis. I'm curious what you think the implications are in this for client sends first, though. So there's a race condition, right, if the server sending setting, and what that means if clients should, compliant clients who understand this should be basically waiting for the settings frame before doing coalescing on that connection.
Another comment from Jabba, Eric Nygren. Given the OPSEC discussion, we might need separate settings for each of allow mixed scheme and do not allow mixed origins, since they have different details. Still on the fence settings versus the more complex origin frame.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, I'm just going to echo what Patrick said. I think the simplification here is something we can see is very useful immediately right now. I'm less convinced by Eric's additional bit, and that's twice as many bits. But I would like to resolve that discussion as well. I think we need to probably, I don't know if we can make that decision right now. I'm not sure that I've got enough of a sense of what's going on to actually make a conclusion today.
So, Eric Scorla, I mean, as Patrick suggests, it seems that the primary pain point is people who prefer to have essentially no connection coalescence. So that's, I think, what that suggests, and it seems like I would suggest the following cut, which is that we add the bit that says I don't want connection coalescence, and then if in future we decide we wish to have a way to say I would support the following demands, then that can have either two impacts. It can say, so the way what you would say, if you wanted to support a subset of the cert, you send a thing that said don't coalesce in general and coalesce for these, and then if you sent, and then the relying party could look and say, if someone said coalesce for these, and that was a list that was bigger than the cert, and we also have additional certs, then that tells you to ask for additional certs as well. And so I think that seems like a cut that we can allow us to, philosophically appropriately get something easily done now, and then add something new later without having two new mechanisms later. So that was what I would suggest.
And that's roughly what I was thinking is that you can build on this and have a graceful ramp up the complexity. Regarding the situation I think you described, where you might have a race there, one would assume that not all clients are going to support this at least immediately, so you're still going to have to generate the 421s, but it becomes a one-bit decision. It's basically, send the setting as a server and also 421 anything that's out of scope, and so that's just a flag, in your configuration. So I'm not too worried about that race. We could talk about some sort of sticky setting. Hey, that's the second time that's come up today, but that's not necessary in this case, I think.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, I was going to go to the sticky setting point. You have 0 RTT coming back in the next connection. Client speaks first. The client could remember that last time the server asked that it not coalesce and do that. It's kind of off the books. I don't think I need to worry about that too much. We have the backstop. We have the 421, and people should be respecting the 421, and that, to me, is sufficient.
Right. To me, if a client were to want to remember the fact that it received this bit in the past and maybe not use coalescing for some period of time, that's an implementation decision. We don't require anyone to coalesce. So
It's opaque to the network anyway.
exactly.
The key point here is to avoid the case where you coalesce 100 origins onto this connection and you have to 421 every single one of those origins one by one by one by one.
Yeah.
And that's annoying.
Yeah.
So this has some real utility. So let's just do a bit.
Okay.
So from a document point of view, are you going to just fork this and pursue two paths, or?
With my editor hat on, I think what I would do is park and change the origin frame document to a parked state. And Eric, please speak up now if you disagree. Park that, create a new document with a one setting. It should be a one-page RFC. Get that through real quick. And if we do need a second bit for do not allow mixed schemes, as Eric is suggesting, that should probably go in the OPSEC document. I think that's the most appropriate place for it. Eric, does that all make some amount of sense to you? I can do it, Karsten. It's okay. Yes, makes sense. Good. Okay. Cool.
Terrific. So the only other active document that leaves us with is the cookies document, 6265bis, for which there has not been a lot of activity since we last met together, right?
Mm. Well, Mike submitted the, 00.
Right. We have a 00, but it still needs to encompass a number of other internet drafts, right?
Yes. So the plan is for Patrick and I to get out our whips and make sure that those documents are incorporated. I think Mike has, to his credit, a lot of work to do there. And incorporate the drafts that we've accepted, present that to the working group, and we can, start talking about how that went, basically. But that might take him some time. He's got other stuff on his plate, and I think that's okay.
I agree.
Yeah.
Does anyone from the floor want to have a little cookie talk, or?
Yeah, we can certainly still talk about them. The cookies were very small. They were compressed this week, I noticed.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we've kind of talked that one out.
Good. Okay. So if we look back at our agenda, it is just about 3 o'clock, so we got 30 minutes left. We can talk, it should only take a couple of minutes to talk about the 2 outstanding calls for adoption. And then Nick can give us some experience on implementing the draft or the RFC for alternate services and the internet draft for opportunistic encryption on the server side. So one call for adoption we made was for what is known as Draft Stenberg, which is the TCP tuning for HTTP document. And I'm going to try and characterize sort of what we got as feedback, and then Mark can correct me if he disagrees. But what we largely heard was people were very interested in the space this document was working on, but they were concerned that it read like a configuration guide for a server rather than talking about the interaction between TCP and the application layer protocol. So we talked with some transport folks about how that could be improved. And we talked with Daniel and Tim W. Can you help me with Tim's last name there, Mark? Tim W., chair of DNS Op, an all-around nice guy, who is Daniel's co-author on that draft, about what they wanted to do. And there have been a number of developments there. So Daniel was elected to not pursue another version of that draft, but Tim would like to. And with some help from Mira and Allison Mankin over on the transport side, Allison has agreed to provide some transport level advice to that document, and Tim is going to produce another version, likely with a new co-author, which I think is not settled, so I don't want to rope him in unless he chooses to stand up and identify him or herself. No, I don't think they're even in the room, to be honest. And And so I think that's what we're waiting for as a next step. So we're essentially looking for a new iteration on that draft to be reborn, and then we'll probably survey this community again to see if they're interested in adopting that. Although we know in principle you just like to see a different manifestation thereof. So do you want to talk about secondary certs?
I thought we had a request to push that off.
To push that to Thursday? We will do our best on Thursday. It's a full agenda.
What we could do, perhaps, if no one objects, we've got Nick's presentation still today. How long did you need for that, Nick? 10? Maybe we should do that, and then, if time permits, get to immutable? Or are you not ready?
No, I'm not ready for immutable. We can move up Kazuho. He's prepared to go today. We won't have trouble filling the time. That's not a problem.
I know. All right.
So why don't we move on to Nick?
Nick, and then maybe Kazuho. Yeah.
And then we can talk about if we have a kind of work we'd like to adopt. Okay. So Nick has very kindly agreed to make this presentation, and I view this as an important IETF contribution. Mind the note well, of course. This is feedback on things we have recently published as an RFC, and recently published a series of internet drafts for, and this can only help us inform us as to whether or not those have been good ideas. So I really appreciate him taking the time to do this. So without further ado, Nick.
Sure, I can do that from here, so I can read the slides. It's pretty text heavy. So next slide, please. Let's see. Can you, pardon me? Yeah.
The pink box.
Yeah. All right. So this is experience that I had at Cloudflare implementing the opportunistic security draft, which was originally called opportunistic encryption. It's basically a header to signal to the browser or to the user agent that the site is accessible over TLS, so HTTP over TLS, and it enables HTTP2 and other sort of things for non-HTTPS sites. So sites for which the scheme is HTTP, you can now access it over a transport that is encrypted. Typically, this is 443. The one sort of key point for this is not HTTPS. This is, as a browser, it's not treated as part of the secure context. This is just HTTP over a different transport. And originally, it was proposed such that the certificate did not need to be validated. Next slide, please. So this ID has been around since 2014, and there's been quite a few ecosystem changes with regard to HTTPS and TLS since then. The biggest of which is that it's a lot easier to get a valid certificate now and less costly. So there are things like Let's Encrypt. There are things like Cloudflare's Universal SSL that have come out since then that allow you to, for free, have TLS and a TLS certificate for your site. But this does not help necessarily anyone to fix a site in order to make it fully HTTPS compliant, meaning all sub-resources, active and passive, available over HTTPS, or even in the HTML link references being HTTPS. So since then, because the certificates are easier to obtain that are valid, there was additions to the draft to allow you to require certificate validation for opportunistic encryption, and thus the name was changed to opportunistic security. Next slide, please. This is just sort of an overview of Cloudflare. We have, it's a CDN or something along those lines. Basically, we sit in front of HTTP sites or HTTPS sites, and there are sort of various tiers of customers. But generally, overall, there are somewhere 5 million sites. People pay us from nothing to quite a lot. Next slide, please. The general architecture is, you can think of it as Nginx in the cloud. It's HTTP, HTTPS reverse proxy. Next slide. So in September, we decided to launch several features at once to try to generally improve, without customers having to do anything, the level of security for their sites. The first was we introduced an early draft of TLS 1.3 for all customers. This is for sites that are already HTTPS compliant. We introduced a feature called automatic HTTPS rewrites, which would take links inside of the HTML pages of our customers and add S's in the scheme, where in places that we knew that the site was available over TLS. And the third piece was opportunistic encryption. And this is something that we enabled for all free and pro sites. So several million sites, we enabled opportunistic encryption. Next slide, please. And to do that, we used, as defined in the specification, in the ID, the alternative services header. And we very simply just said H2 is available at 443. And because Cloudflare has, through the Universal SSL initiative for all these customers, we do have valid certificates for every one of these sites. And those valid certificates are available on 443. We can do this. And we also enabled the .well-known, which was an addition to the draft to help make sure that you could do certificate validation. We chose a max age of 60 seconds to be conservative. Next slide, please. So the results of this were that this was implemented as part of a tiered Nginx structure. When we originally tried to build this, we tried to look to see how we could identify and distinguish between connections that were opportunistically encrypted versus those over HTTPS. And one kind of shortcut that was easy if we wanted to just look at the headers was the alt used header, which turned out to not be universal, especially in privacy modes. So we had to make changes to our Nginx to extract the scheme pseudo header, which was not something that was very easily exposed. So this actually did require some surgery to the code to expose. Another result of this was that for some sites in which we did not have a certificate, sites in which we are not able to, for one reason or another, issue certificates, for a short period of time, we issued this header, and it resulted in failed connections. So this is maybe something that is not necessarily in the spirit of opportunistic security, and this might be a suggestion for the draft, is potentially having one failed connection and then a reload is not necessarily a good user experience. But it did allow us to notice whether this is broken or not, which is an important piece. All in all, we ended up with something between 25 and 75 requests per second that were encrypted, that previous to this were not encrypted. Next slide. I took a small sample to actually investigate and see how close, how much of this is, how well this worked really. And one thing that I didn't mention is that we only enabled the header for Firefox browser. That is the only user agent that currently implements this functionality. So this header was not sent universally. It was only sent to user agents as were matched. And this is a small sample from October, where we had 143,000 requests from the OE supporting versions of Firefox. 21% were HTTPS, 26% had been upgraded to HTTP over TLS, either H2 or Speedy, using opportunistic encryption, and 53% were plain text. So basically what this shows is that there's 21% of requests could have been upgraded. These are ones for which the browser either had not cached the alternative service, or they perhaps might be visiting it for the first time. So either the 60-second short alt service header had expired, or the browser hadn't seen it at all. And there was a small percentage here, about 10% of those plain text ones were just because we did not have a certificate for those domains. Next slide, please. So as a result of this, we found that quite a lot of connections of requests are encrypted that would not have been encrypted otherwise. And if the final version of the specification that includes the validation of certificates, these would also be over validated TLS connections. A lot of people did not get the benefit of this because they had explicitly disabled Httpbis, and there's still some investigation we need to do to see if improving the TTLs or increasing it from 60 seconds would actually improve the ratio. And it's possible, this is a suggestion, that Firefox could use opportunistic encryption more aggressively on the first page. So perhaps loading the .well known ahead of loading the head page, something like this. There's if you look through the network inspector and DevTools, you can see what order of operations things happen, and this could potentially be optimized. Next slide, please. So our conclusions from this experiment, or this product launch, or whatever you want to call it, is that opportunistic encryption did provide some performance benefits as well as security benefits for some sites, although for some sites it did make it slower. Having an HTTP site over TLS 1.2 has additional latency on the initial connection, and sometimes using H2 over H1 gives you enough compensation in terms of speeding things up to make up for that. Sometimes it did not. But generally, people did not notice whether a site was opportunistically encrypted or not. We got almost no reports of this, and generally, I think the advantage of opportunistic security is not to protect against specific attackers, but just to make sure that plain text is not available for bulk surveillance and bulk collection of data. And it works especially well for customers who are, I guess, maybe you could say negligent, or sort of people who had built websites and don't actively maintain them. So they're not going to go ahead and rewrite their HTML content or their legacy HTML content or really do anything. So one of the biggest use cases for this is adding the header for sites that wouldn't have done anything anyways, and basically eliminate plain text to a certain degree on the internet. So no customers reported choosing opportunistic security over actually fixing their content. It was mostly an automatic thing for them. Next slide. That's basically it. That's the overview of this opportunistic security experience that we had with Cloudflare. It was interesting and fun, and it actually did introduce quite a few new TLS connections that we would have not had before. But considering that Firefox is not a majority browser, it did not make sort of a massive dent, but it did make a dent. That's it. Thanks.
Any questions or comments?
And anyone else for the blue sheets? Anybody need the blue sheets?
Excellent. Thank you, Nick, so much for doing that.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I mean, so data on implementations of things that are internet drafts is just exceedingly valuable to our process. So for doing that, that's my great appreciation. So I think we're going to be able to pencil in Kazuho, who had made a proposal about early hints in a 103 response header to the mailing list a week or so ago. We were trying to put you on Thursday, so this is a deviation from the theme. This is potential future work, but I suspect we weren't going to have time for you then. So let's do it now if you're ready.
Thank you for the time, and let me talk about 103 early hints. Next slide, please. So what it is, 103 early hints is a status code that indicates that the server is likely to send a final request with the headers included in the informational response. Next slide, please. So this is the one of the use cases. So it's actually sending a HTTP push while processing the request. So when the client sends a request through an intermediary to a application server, the application server can first send the link headers using 103 response, which gets converted into HTTP to push, and then process the request. So by the time the client starts receiving the HTML, the pushed resources would be ready on the client side. So next slide, please. And the next use case is for sending links of external resources like ads, for example. You cannot push resources outside the origin because HTTP2 is bound to each origin. But if we could use 103 early hints to push just the links earlier, then we could let the client start fetching those third-party resources before the HTML or the main response arrives. Next slide, please. And there could be other use cases as well. For example, you could opportunistically push a location header, or you could push a shared dictionary, or you could use it for other things as well. Next slide, please. And the spec says that it's the header sent in the 103 informational response is just a hint. So it doesn't change the existing semantics of HTTP. And in HTTP2, since we have HBAC, there's basically no bandwidth overhead for repeating same headers. Next slide, please. And on the mailing list, we've seen some discussion about whether we should use a opt-in using request headers, since many client implementations are likely to be broken on properly handling informational responses. But unfortunately, there'd be intermediaries that fail to handle hop-by-hop headers designated by connection headers. So even if we introduced a header-based negotiation, then there'd be interoperability issues. So this is all from me. Thank you.
I'll repeat what I said on the list. I think this is a really elegant trade-off. We've had this problem expressed in various ways over the years of, not knowing what the status code is, but still needing to send information to the client. And you don't want it to be unbounded, which is kind of the trailer's position, because you're requiring the client to do a lot of arbitrary buffering. So this is a nice, elegant trade-off for getting some important information to the client early. I hear the concern on the list about interoperability, that a lot of clients can't handle this. To me personally, I think that the majority use case for this is going to be over HTTPS, which means that the intermediaries that are going to be on the path are either under control of the server, who can decide whether they admit it or not, or they're intermediaries who frankly shouldn't be there. So that's fine. It also seems to me personally that the majority use case for this is for browsing. And so the big question is not whether the 14 billion different HTTP clients can handle 1xx non-final response status code correctly, but whether the browsers can. And as long as there's some sane path for that, this seems really exciting to me. I see a thumbs up in the audience. Yeah. So maybe we should do a little testing around the browsers if we haven't already. And yeah.
You published an endpoint too. They made it pretty easy just to click and test the browser, which was very appreciative.
And so far so good with that, right? So far so good. Like the browsers we've checked are all good with that, right?
Well, I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna throw stones from up here.
So Mike Bishop, Microsoft, speaking for IE and Edge, the stack itself handles it just fine. The dev tools do not. We're fixing that.
Okay.
So actually it goes the other way around. The dev tools showed that the response was 103.
Right.
And had no body.
That doesn't seem like a deal killer though.
No.
Yeah. If nothing else, I know of 2 implementations that have been fixed just because of this discussion on the list. So
which is awesome.
It's great for the ecosystem.
Yeah.
All right.
Julian, so I just got the question, will this be exposed in JavaScript? And of course, the answer is we'll need a new API in JavaScript to expose that status code if we wanted that.
This becomes much like the trailers discussion.
It does. It becomes very similar, and I think, yeah, a lot of the same considerations come into play. I would say, personally, my gut feeling on that is eventually, and we probably need to talk to Anna.
Much like trailers, these are defined to be purely informational.
Right, and that's the beauty of it. Is it? Do you want to get a sense of the room, or it's very quick, but
Does any? I mean, this is potential work that is nice and clean and easy, which is part of what's attractive here. Can we get a sense of the room of who would be interested in implementing this from whatever role you play in the ecosystem? Show of hands, maybe.
I actually discussed that with the lead author of the Apache HTTP client, and he, for some other reasons, he was just in the process in adding an API, a callback API, so that the library users would actually see informational status codes. So it wasn't broken anyway, but he was just in the process of adding support to expose that information.
Okay. So thank you.
thank you very much.
So we have about 10 minutes left. Do you want to address one final topic while we've got everyone
What do
together?
we have left?
Talk about experimentals and
Yeah,
workloads.
sure. That's appropriate.
You can go first.
All right.
Yeah.
So, as Patrick has gotten on board and up to speed, one of the things we've been discussing between ourselves is, what an appropriate level of work for the group is. We've been doing a fair number of drafts in parallel in recent history after HTTP2 finished. And some of that work we had high hopes for in the beginning, and then, it lost steam, or we downgraded drafts to experimental because we couldn't find interested implementers of a certain part of the ecosystem. And so, the first question then is that a good or a bad thing? I don't necessarily, and I think Patrick's in agreement that it's not necessarily bad to do experimental work. That gives us a chance to try out things and see what they are, as long as we're labeling it appropriately, that's okay. But we wanted to get a sense of the room of how people feel about the pace of work we're doing. And the other consideration that comes into play is that a decent portion of the participants in this working group are now participating in another working group, which we just had this morning. And while we have a liaison with Quick, there's also a fairly deep participation by a lot of our very active members. And so we want to be careful not to overload folks. So with that in mind, we're trying to consciously think about, what work we take on, making sure that we finish the work that we've already taken on appropriately, and things like that. Did you want to add anything to that, or?
It's just something to be cognizant of when we talk about future calls for adoption, and maybe when we talk Thursday through individual proposals.
Yes.
To set a context for that, and I would welcome any comments anyone had on the scope of what we've been doing, or what's important to them, because everyone's time is valuable. But I also think we're doing valuable work, so I just want to see how that's impacting everyone as a professional.
And certainly the work we just heard about from Kazuho, like you just said, it's nice because it's quite compact. And even if we, spend a little time talking about it and ship it, I think the commitment there is much smaller than the bigger pieces. I think the part of the reluctance around things like what was JFV and now appears to be bookbombing the common header syntax is that's a potentially big ball of work. And the conclusion is not a clean, quick thing. It's important work, and that's why we're still talking about it. But it certainly is something we're a little more hesitant to take on.
Julian, I think the whole topic of mapping HTTP to Quick and what that actually means for what actually are we mapping to quick? Will that be the exactly what is HTTP2, or will it be something else? Do we need a new version of HPAC? If we do a new version of HPAC, do we do that here or in quick? Will it only work for quick or also for other transports? All that will be a lot of work that will affect the people in this working group no matter where it happens. So.
Yes. And that's actually a really nice lead into another thing that we probably need to start carving time out for in our agenda, which is, you know, I think from the conversations I've overheard, people so far are generally pretty happy for quick to be a direct mapping of HTTP2 semantics to the new transport as much as possible. But that's not something we've taken a position on yet as a working group. And so we do need to have that discussion. We need to give that feedback to the quick working group. And also, as you say, if there is going to be a new version of HPAC, we need to be involved in that too.
Ted Hardy, about a different mapping problem. Patrick, is it your intent that if the BOF goes well tonight, or the bar BOF goes well on HTTP and DNS, that there would be a different working group that work would be related to? Or would you anticipate it coming into here because that would impact sort of the energy in the group and who else you needed to coordinate with? So it'd be interesting to know.
So that's part of the discussion this evening.
Alexei tells me that as area director, he will ultimately decide whether somebody else's problem or his.
I'll give you my 2 cents. Historically, we've focused on HTTP itself as a protocol, and specific vertical applications in HTTP, like Acme, for example. We tend to not want to take those on here, while we are happy to give them advice and sometimes hit them over the head with it.
Thanks, it's very clear. Patrick, by the way, I sent you email, but probably too late. If you have an end time for tonight's bar BOF, it might be good to let us know what that
Budget
is.
an hour.
Budget an hour.
Which
Okay,
means
great.
2.
Well, see, there's a big difference between those two about whether you eat before or after, right? So if I'm budgeting 1, I'll eat after. Okay, there's several people are saying they're eating after, so I will not be alone if I sneak out. Thanks for the
1 hour. I've still got a fever. So I think it's a wrap for today.
Sure.
We'll see you all on Thursday. Thanks for coming.
Thanks very much.
Nice.
Remember, there's still no, that doesn't matter. She never counts.
How are you?
Proxy your answer.
Bad idea.
That seems
Okay. And then you give it a day or 2 and then upload it or I guess, yeah. So, right. So
I'll be getting 1 or 2 experimental documents.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So
Before Christmas.
Yeah.